Our final speaker in this morning's session is Dr. Emily Fenichel, who's assistant professor at Florida Atlantic University. The title of her talk is Michelangelo's Portrait Medal, the Penitent Artist in His Final Years. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fenichel to the podium.
Thank you very much to the Frick, particularly since I am here and not in South Florida this morning. I think it is safe to say that many of us, even if we don't study the Italian Renaissance, have some preconceived notions about the artist Michelangelo. Some examples of these preconceptions include, although a brilliant artist, Michelangelo was difficult, if not impossible, to work with, and subsequently never collaborated with others. Other preconceptions include that Michelangelo was a man obsessed with carving stone, raising his social standing, and denouncing his critics. Still more include that his art was singular, unchanging, and only depicted secular and humanist investigations of the male nude. I hope many of these sound familiar. These popular attitudes about the artist help explain why Michelangelo's portrait medal there we go, has no widely accepted interpretation. A portrait medal not only reveals the physical appearance of the subject, it also gives a notion of their inner life through the impresa on the reverse. As Stephen K. Scher noted, portrait medals have enabled their subjects to celebrate, quote, their successes and intellectual accomplishments, their personal skills, courage, hopes, and aspirations, their most valued attributes, their religious and philosophical beliefs, end quote. Theorists such as Paolo Giovio, as we've just heard, even likened the combination of motto and image in an impresa to the body and soul of the subject. In the case of Michelangelo's portrait medal, however, scholars have been at a loss to explain what this impresa might reveal about the artist. The reverse of Michelangelo's portrait medal depicts a man whom Vasari identified as a blind pilgrim. This identification is supported by the walking stick the man uses, as well as the rosary and canteen in the man's possession. The elderly gentleman is thus led by Fido, or faith, and he strides behind his intrepid hound. Given Michelangelo's own features, the pilgrim's powerful body twists as he strides forward. Though his face is in profile, the pilgrim's muscular back is rotated so that it is almost fully exposed to the viewer. As he advances through the austere and rocky landscape, the flowing robes on the lower half of his body cling to his legs, revealing their form. The motto encircling the scene is taken from Psalm 50, verse 15, and translates to, I will teach the unjust thy ways, and the wicked shall be converted to thee. The impresa does not advertise Michelangelo's artistic talents, his love of stone, his pretensions to nobility, his humanist education, or his famous temper. Nor does he challenge his critics on the medal. And finally, it is difficult to connect this medal to any significant moment in the artist's life that he might wish to commemorate. Indeed, the only aspect of this work that is consistent with what we know of the artist is the powerful male body depicted. Otherwise, it might be easy to see why scholars have claimed that the medal, quote, has no obvious application to Michelangelo, end quote. I believe, however, that this medal is uniquely poised to help us understand Michelangelo's late period. In the impresa, Michelangelo presents himself as a penitent artist evangelist in the tradition of both King David and Savonarola. Such a characterization carries strong implications for Michelangelo's late period and the definition of a successful religious artist in the Counter-Reformation. Further, Michelangelo exploited the singular qualities of portrait medals, such as their collaborative creation and ease of distribution, to help craft an object that spoke to his unique situation as an aged artist navigating this new religious era. Far from having no obvious application to the artist, the medal is representative of the last years of Michelangelo's life. Psalm 50 is attributed to King David and is among the most famous of the Old Testament figure's penitential works. It is an extended plea to God for forgiveness, bolstered by promises of the services David will be able to render unto the Lord after his soul is cleansed by righteous forgiveness. In taking the 15th verse from the psalm as his motto, Michelangelo offers David's prayer as his own. Both seek atonement through penance. David, and Michelangelo through his allusion to the psalm, begins his penitential prayer by crying out, "Have mercy on me, O God." He appeals to the Lord's multitude of tender mercies, admitting that to thee only have I sinned and have done evil before thee. Verse 8 marks a turning point in the psalm, as David no longer pleads for forgiveness, but instead finds comfort in the uncertain and hidden things of thy wisdom thou hast made manifest to me, end quote. David believes that he has favored status with God and will be forgiven. After this point, David's faith allows him to hope that God will create a clean heart in me. Verse 15, the verse that Michelangelo chooses for his motto, marks another significant shift in the psalm, as David relates to God what he will do in gratitude for this divine forgiveness. He will, for example, teach the unjust thy ways, extol thy justice, and declare thy praise. In short, David and Michelangelo, through his choice of motto, will proselytize. Sinners like David and Michelangelo must ask for God's mercy and hope for absolution. After attaining forgiveness, sinners must further hope for the understanding to live a better life. As might be expected from a penitential psalm, such behavior defines the very nature of penance. Penance depends upon the idea that God will forgive those who recognize their sin and sincerely ask for God's mercy. Penitent petitioners are given some form of service to God, such as prayer or even the mortification of the physical body in order to save their soul. Whatever the service, its purpose is to humble the sinner before God and his community. After the completion of these tasks, the sinner will again be pure in spirit, forgiven by God. And pilgrimage was a popular penitential option, as it was a public confession of sin, as well as a difficult and humbling experience for the penitent. The arduousness of pilgrimage as a form of penance is pictured in Michelangelo's Impresa. Michelangelo, as the humbled pilgrim, walks barefoot. Dressed in clothing that will offer little protection against the elements, he carries few possessions for his journey. This pilgrim will have to depend upon charity along the way. Compounding Michelangelo's already difficult path is the fact that he, as the pilgrim, is blind, dependent upon a guide dog to show him the way. Undaunted by these hardships, the pilgrim strides out on his public voyage towards God's forgiveness. In the image of his metaphoric pilgrimage, together with the invocation of Psalm 50, Michelangelo confesses his sinful nature, provides proof of his contrition, and renders service unto God. He continues on, paralleling the words of David's psalm in the hopes of becoming sinless once again in the view of heaven. The particular choice of the 15th verse of Psalm 50, however, means that Michelangelo's motives were more than purely penitential. Verse 15 is a turning point in the psalm, as David begins to commend himself to God's service, offering to proselytize after his soul is washed clean. Michelangelo, likewise, wants to use his incipient absolution to bring souls to God. As such, Michelangelo is closely following an interpretation of the psalm by the Catholic reformer who took over Florence in the artist's youth, Savonarola. Savonarola's commentary on Psalm 50 was written while awaiting execution in Florence. Smuggled out of the monk's prison cell, it quickly became popular, with 8 Latin editions and 5 Italian editions in print before the end of 1500. As might be expected from the fiery preacher who turned Florence into a theocracy in the late Quattrocento, the idea of teaching the unjust thy ways was one with which he was quite taken. Savonarola explains in his analysis of verse 15 that, quote, "If you strengthen me with a willing spirit, then I will teach transgressors your ways. This is not something difficult for you. Neither can my sins stand in your way if you want to do this," end quote. Savonarola's reading of the verse is fundamentally conditional. If one is forgiven by God, then one will have the power to successfully convert sinners. Redemption, however, must happen before successful proselytizing. A similarly dependent relationship between penance and proselytizing is explored in Michelangelo's Impresa. The pilgrim is still traveling in the image on the medal. He wanders blind and barefoot, with no church, town, or destination in the background to indicate when the journey might end. Temporally, Michelangelo's Impresa shows the artist occupying a time between his sinful existence and his redemption. The artist thus characterizes himself as far away from the state of grace required to teach the unjust thy ways. Neither the image nor the motto indicates when or if Michelangelo will ever reach the state of grace he seeks. The medal attests only to the artist's spiritual journey and hope. In short, Michelangelo's portrait medal is about two fundamental ideas, penance and proselytizing. He advertises himself as a sinner, a penitent, and a man eager to be forgiven so that he might be able to convert other sinners. On its surface, the medal has little or nothing to do with the arrogant, solitary, and combative humanist I described earlier. Taken in a broader context, with his life after the completion of the Last Judgment in 1541 and until his death in 1564, however, the object is emblematic of Michelangelo in the early days of the Counter-Reformation. It shows him collaborating, publicly admitting fault, and attempting to figure out how to be a religious artist in a world that had fundamentally changed. The unique qualities inherent to portrait medals aided Michelangelo in advertising this particular message. Firstly, medals are collaborative. Even Michelangelo, who might have known how to cast the medal, sought out former papal goldsmith Leone Leoni for help in creating this work. Leone even tucked his signature, this Leo here, underneath the folds in Michelangelo's cassock. The letters that passed back and forth between Leone and Michelangelo indicate that both artists had a hand in the design and that Leone cast the final product. Leone was an experienced medal maker and had crafted portrait medals not only for patrons but also for himself, as we've just seen. He knew how to use the medium to express the body and soul of its subject. Far from being openly hostile to such collaboration, Michelangelo rejoiced in the teamwork, sending Leone several drawings and a wax model in gratitude. This warm and productive collaborative relationship, moreover, was not an anomaly in Michelangelo's late period. He collaborated with younger artists with increasing frequency as he grew older. The works that resulted from these relationships, such as the painting you see on the screen, were recognized in their own time as being the product of both artists. These collaborators were not merely executing Michelangelo's vision, but contributed their own creative energies as well. This Pontormo painting, for example, is not discussed in contemporary biographies about Michelangelo, despite it being created after one of his drawings. Instead, it is discussed in Pontormo's biography as a painting which benefited from both artists' work. The creation of his portrait medal is another instance of this cooperative trend in Michelangelo's late period, one where both artists share credit for a single work. In addition to being collaborative, medals were also made to be public and portable. Leone, for example, made several copies of Michelangelo's medal and sent them to his established patrons at the Habsburg courts in Spain and Flanders, ensuring that the resulting object was widely known. Scholars such as Michael Baxendale have even tied the revival of portrait medals in the 15th century to frustrations about other objects' lack of portability. Paintings and sculptures, although used in the fashioning of a public image, cannot reach the audience that a portrait medal can. In the case of Michelangelo's medal, it was known, like the artist himself, internationally and in the highest echelons of European society. It is worth wondering, then, why Michelangelo exploited the medium in the way that he did. I have interpreted the medal as showing the artist as an as-yet unredeemed sinner engaged in a physically demanding form of penance in the hopes of one day proselytizing. Such an impresa is hardly flattering. As Michelangelo was never a member of the clergy, the only method I can imagine for him to use in converting sinners must be his art. The Impresa then makes the damning statement that Michelangelo's religious art is ineffective, quite the admission for a man who worked for a number of popes. Moreover, it is completely out of character for the artist who, as we agreed earlier, was both arrogant and the consummate self-promoter. So how do we explain it? Although the message of the medal can be partially explained by Michelangelo's constant fear of death and the afterlife, I think that we can bring more nuance and specificity to our interpretation. I believe the key to understanding the context for the Impresa lies with Michelangelo's completion of the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. Contemporary sources indicate that criticism of the fresco began even before the work was finished. For example, the papal master of ceremonies, who saw the painting in progress, deemed it fit only for a bathhouse. Michelangelo famously retaliated, and his critic ended up in a rather painful predicament in the artist's imagining of hell. Although this is one of the most memorable critiques of the work, there were certainly many others who took exception to the fresco, nor did the furor die down quickly after the work was completed. The Last Judgment became the touchstone for debates about religious art in the Counter-Reformation. And this meant that Michelangelo was subject to a near constant stream of criticism for decades. And most of this criticism centered around two ideas. One, that the work of art was neither appropriate nor religiously effective, and two, that no proper Christian could have produced the fresco. For example, Pietro Aretino said of the Last Judgment in 1550, quote, "And yet he who is a Christian," and I think we can read that in air quotes, right? "And yet he who is a Christian, by valuing art more than faith, makes such a genuine spectacle out of both the lack of decorum in the martyrs and virgins that even in a brothel, eyes would shut so as not to see it. It would be less of a sin for you not to believe than by believing in this manner to weaken the faith of others," end quote. The critiques of Aretino and others were the beginning of an attempt to redefine religious art and the religious artist during a time of great uncertainty after the Protestant Reformation. And Michelangelo was a central part of this great uncertainty. One thing that his critics agreed upon, however, was that only good Christians could make effective religious art. In other words, if Michelangelo had been a good Christian, then the Last Judgment would have been capable of bringing souls to God. As it stood, Aretino and others thought it was more detrimental to the faithful than helpful, and Michelangelo's own personal faith, or lack thereof, was responsible. Michelangelo's art was under attack, but so was his soul. In the face of such criticism, Michelangelo decided to remake himself as an old man. For example, pilgrimage became more than a useful metaphor to the artist. He undertook a pilgrimage to the Virgin's house in Loreto in 1556, as well as completing a pilgrimage to 7 churches in Rome during the Jubilee year of 1550. In his quest for spiritual fulfillment, he largely abandoned making public paintings and sculptures. Indeed, Michelangelo became wary of the graphic arts as a whole in this period, describing his obsession with sculpture and painting in Sonnet 285 as, quote, "the affectionate fantasy that made art an idol and sovereign to me," end quote. The final stanza boldly proclaims, quote, "neither painting nor sculpture will be able any longer to calm my soul," end quote. In other words, he accepts the criticism leveled at him by Aretino. He had placed art above religion. His soul, in its current state, was not pure enough or redeemed enough to bring others to God. In his current state, he may even do more harm than good. His late drawings and sculptures, therefore, stayed private. There are 2 important exceptions to Michelangelo's artistic privacy. One is the collection of poems he intended to publish. The verses I quoted here are not the only in Michelangelo's written work to reject art in favor of religion and the restoration of the artist's soul. As his poetry in this period became increasingly religious, spiritual, and penitential. These poems, however, were not published in the artist's lifetime, as Michelangelo's poetic collaborator, Luigi del Riccio, died before the volume was completed. Therefore, the penitential message of the sonnets, the acknowledgement of the truth of his critics, and the quest to restore his soul were never shared with the public as Michelangelo intended. The other exception to the artist's increasing artistic privacy was Michelangelo's portrait medal. In many ways, it functions as a replacement for those never published sonnets. Rather than present himself as the arrogant, difficult humanist we know and love, he shows himself as a humble and penitent sinner. The work is surprisingly collaborative, starkly public, and agrees with the artist's critics. It shows Michelangelo seeking a new, unknown way forward in the wake of the disastrous criticism about his soul and his art after the Last Judgment. He hopes to be able to make works that will bring souls to God in the future. In other words, far from having no obvious application to the artist's life, it is characteristic of the artist's late period and should be understood as the key to understanding Michelangelo as he faced death. Thank you.